Path of Exile 2 has a problem, and I don't know how the devs can fix it. I'm talking about loot, of course. Setting aside the obvious disclaimers that the game is still in early access, I'm a little concerned about the general trend of its design in regard to gearing and progression. But before going down that rabbit hole, let's listen to a segment of an interview by Ziggy D asking game directors Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts about crafting and loot so we can have a better understanding of what their intent was heading into Path of Exile 2's early access launch.
So we really want to make it so that you're finding crafting items all the time. You're using those crafting items way more often than you were in PoE1.
Yeah.
That you like just the game of like picking something up, like seeing what I could modify it to, and then actually equipping those items is just happening way more often. And there's so many subtle changes around this, like in terms of just like the way that the base mods scale and items and the like things like that, like all the stuff to kind of make it so that as you find new base types and new things, like you've got a reason to craft them. Part of that is making sure that you've got enough of that currency. It actually took us a long time to even get comfortable with the idea of making something like an Exalt drop that often, because there's just this thing in your cemented in your mind of like this is rare, right? Like it's an Exalt, how can it possibly drop like multiple times in Act 1?
From this and a number of other interviews, it's pretty clear the devs intended for players to craft modifiers onto their items throughout the campaign and to consistently make incremental improvements to their builds. As it stands right now, I'd argue loot feels too scarce throughout the campaign to meet this goal, even with the patch that improved drop rates. I don't want to throw out an arbitrary number for how often I think loot should drop, since the community would never reach consensus on a number anyway, so instead I'll ask a question. How often would you need to find a piece of currency to meet the developer's intended goals of being able to constantly improve your gear? Statistically, Acts 1 and 2 should be outliers in terms of receiving upgrades because your character and build isn't very well established at that point, but if we took Jonathan at his word that we'd have a reason to be upgrading our gear even in Act 1, and we have 9 to 12 item slots depending on whether you're using a two-handed weapon and or the weapon swapping system, how many pieces of gear should we be expecting to upgrade each act, and how often should we be replacing them? To be clear, I'm not arguing that every item should have 6 mods early on in the campaign, but I don't think the current drop rate of loot allows players to feel good crafting extra modifiers on their gear, especially when they can craft dead modifiers on items like increased light radius. To add on to that, if you're finding incrementally better base items throughout the campaign, how much more currency would you need if you're supposed to keep replacing gear? I don't want to pull some numbers out of my ass here, but what I can say is that on my first character, I was using my Exalts and Orbs of Alchemy a lot more freely because I was under the impression that we were meant to be crafting on a gear more often, and that was a mistake. After I cleared Act 3, I noticed my damage was kind of falling off, and since I'd kind of already cleared the campaign, I decided to use the trade site because it allowed me to more deterministically get the kind of mods I wanted on my items to take my build to the next level. Theoretically, this is fine and perfectly intended. However, in practice, this makes me want to stop engaging with the crafting system almost entirely. Because the items I can find on the trade site are better tailored to my build, it's exponentially cheaper for me to stockpile my exalted orbs and use them for trading than it is to exalt my gear and hope for a useful modifier. Of course, failing exalt slams will eventually teach players that you actually want to save using them for exceptionally good pieces of gear, but these don't drop very often for a reason, and even if you do get a really good base item, there's always the chance an exalted orb can brick it anyway, whereas if you trade for an item, you can never end up worse than you started. Assuming you didn't get scammed anyway. So if trading is on average cheaper, more reliable, and allows a player to target farm modifiers, then what incentives are there to engage with the crafting system? Love of RNG? Playing solo self-found where you literally can't trade with other people? Really, it only makes the most sense when the costs are low or you're chasing very specific combinations of mods. I don't mind spending Orbs of Augmentation and Transmutation, which combined grant up to 2 modifiers to an item because it takes so little investment to potentially make a return, and I'll even regal something occasionally for a 3rd modifier, but with Exalted Orbs being as rare and valuable as they are now, and the de facto reserve currency of the trade market, I can't justify taking the chance using them when I'd be better served trading them for something else instead. This is all well and good if you're comfortable with trading, but many newer players aren't going to be interacting with the system at all, especially if they're on console, and quite frankly, the solo self-found experience isn't cutting it right now. For some reason, it feels incredibly tedious trying to get the right amount of resistances on your gear to get res capped, let alone finding particularly good base pieces of gear with high armor, evasion, or energy shield rolls to add the right stats to them. Certain modifiers on items are practically mandatory to the point it almost feels criminal when you get something like a really good pair of boots without any movement speed on them. And while the developers intended for us to make incremental improvements to our builds throughout the campaign, I found myself using items from Acts 1 and 2 all the way into Acts 5 and 6 multiple times, which we can chalk up to the game being imbalanced, but I don't know how the devs could realistically fix that without devaluing or hyperinflating the currency market. But this also raises an important question. So what if trade gets hyperinflated with currency? Hypothetically, if trading was inflated to the point that it was more valuable to craft more modifiers onto your gear and then sell it, would that really be a bad thing? I have a feeling the devs might have a sneaking suspicion that the current crafting system is either too frustrating or not that fun to interact with when you have a ton of currency, which, to be fair, was definitely true with how players would slam Orbs of Alteration hundreds or even thousands of times to reroll the stats of magic items in Path of Exile 1. So realistically, what's the solution to these problems? Just increase the amount of loot or currency that drops and let the market sort out the rest? I unironically think this could be a good solution, at least for SSF, but let's be real, there's going to be a ton of masochistic Path of Exile tryhards who jump down my throat in the comments, and I don't think the devs want to go this route either. We could potentially buff the early drop rates of Orbs of Alchemy so that way players can get equipment with 4 mods more consistently. This wouldn't drastically affect the market for Exalted Orbs, and could potentially allow for a wider variety of good base items to enter the marketplace, but it still wouldn't solve the issue of just how much more rewarding it is to trade for items and the proclivity for players to want to hold on to their Exalted Orbs. Another idea would be making items like essences drop more frequently, and potentially adding more tiers so you could have normal items upgraded into rares, but I don't know if the developers would want to shoehorn in more essence encounters throughout the campaign or increase the number of rewards that they drop. One wild idea I've had that I'd be curious to see how it would work but have no expectation to see implemented would be how the game would turn out if magic items had 3 modifiers instead of 2, and that all rare items had 4 modifiers minimum. This would potentially reduce the amount of Exalted Orbs necessary to craft a 6 modifier item and make Orbs of Transmutation and Augmentation more valuable early on, but it might retain the problem of trade offering better gear than RNGesus. All I can say for now is that while I can certainly gear much more efficiently by trading items, making the endeavor worthwhile, it still feels really tedious and slow, and that the divide between trading for gear and crafting my own is too great for crafting to feel sufficiently rewarding. This is only compounded further when I brick a piece of equipment with a mod I don't need, or when I try and switch out another piece of equipment only for my runes to not synergize with my newly found gear. Since I'm making a video talking about loot, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that it's also a little difficult to tell what my character's intended power level should be at, particularly in maps, where I've only had one greater jeweler's orb drop so far. If Doriani occasionally gifted something like a lesser, greater, or even a perfect jeweler's orb on Atlas quest completions, it would give me a better gauge of where my character's supposed to be at in that part of the game. Obviously, this is more of a problem for early access, and maybe I've had bad RNG, but I'm really curious how viable the game is for solo self-found characters. Admittedly, I should probably check the vendors a bit more regularly for gear upgrades, but I'm gonna be honest and say it feels really unintuitive and tedious to go back to every single vendor after I've leveled up to check their inventories, and I'd prefer being able to re-roll their stock for some gold. That might arguably make the single item gamba less attractive, but to be honest, it already feels unattractive to me because I'm more likely than not to get an item I don't even want. Maybe vendor NPCs are the answer to a number of these problems. There's a lot of potential in Expedition, but it's introduced pretty late to the campaign, and I bet the vast majority of players aren't going to know how its vendors work without a tutorial. As it is, I don't think there's enough gold sinks in the game aside from respec costs, so maybe it's something to consider more in the future. There's a lot more that could be said about the balance of specific pieces of loot, and I definitely think we should have different tiers of unique items since so many show up dead on arrival, but these kinds of issues don't address my concerns about the core design philosophy of the game, so I'm going to turn it over to you, the audience. How do you guys currently feel about the state of loot in the game? Are you playing with trade? On softcore or hardcore? Have you tried solo self-found, whether the mode itself or simply by not trading with anyone else? And how has gear progression felt to you? What, if anything, do you think could be done to address your current concerns, and how do you think it would impact the game? I know a lot of people want to see the crafting bench return, so do you think that would be a good fit for Path of Exile 2, or would you prefer even more deterministic crafting like what you can find in Last Epoch? Please let me know in the comments below, as well as your thoughts about the video and what you agreed or disagreed with, because I'm just one dude out here sharing my opinion on the internet. I'm going to make a few more videos covering my thoughts about Path of Exile 2, so be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're interested in that. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons and channel members for their continued support, especially as I branch out and cover different topics like this one, and I'd like to thank you for watching all the way to the end. Until next time, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out. We were meant to be crafting on a gear more often, and that was a mistake.